So let's talk about routing and Patchbays. So here is our hardware output connected to our speakers. Here is our master output from hardware with our connection to our hardware. Now, if you would be recording, you would record on mono tracks, even if it's a stereo signal. Even if it's, for example, in a simple drum recording, a kick drum microphone, a snare microphone, and two overheads. The two overheads, my tip would be to record them in two mono tracks and not use a stereo track. Why? Because this way you can still process the two signals differently if you need, for example, with IQ, to get them to balance a bit better with each other. With a stereo track, you would not be able to do that. Whatever IQ you would do on it, you would be doing it to both microphones. So, a very simple routing for recordings like this would be to use on the overheads mono to stereo connections and connect them to a stereo bus so that you can process them individually, but you can also process the sum of them. For the kick drum and the snare, you would use mono to stereo connection so that these two tracks are connected to the master out this way, and these two tracks would go through a stereo bus, then with a stereo to stereo connection to the master out. When would I use mono buses? I would do so if instead of using only one microphone for the bass drum, I would use two microphones for the bass drum. You usually name it kick in, kick out, so that you don't confuse bass drum with the bass guitar. And for the snare, I would use a snare top and a snare bottom. That means a snare on top of the snare, microphone on top of the snare, and a microphone underneath the snare. So to connect my two kick drums to my mono kick bus, I would need two mono connections, mono to mono. And then to connect that mono bus, I would need a mono to stereo bus to connect it to my master out. The same thing for my snare top and bottom. I would use mono to mono connections to sum them in my mono bus, and then use a mono to stereo connection to connect it to my stereo output. The overheads I would use the same way as before. Mono to stereo to my stereo bus, and then stereo to stereo to my master out. How does this look like in a Patchbay? What is a Patchbay? This is an analog Patchbay. So here you have all your inputs and outputs from all your tracks, all your buses, your compressors, IQs, and so on. And you have to use these cables to connect those inputs and outputs and to do your routing. Patchbays look a bit different in the digital world. So, the setup we had before, we had a kick in, a kick out, snare top, snare bottom, overhead left and right. We had a mono bus for our kick drum a mono bus for our snare drum and a stereo bus for our stereo overheads. So here are all the connections that are available. So here, kick, snare, overheads. So if we want to route our kick in and kick out to our kick bus, we need to select this connection and this connection. If we want to sum the snare top and bottom into our mono snare bus, we need to do the same thing. If we want to connect our overhead left and right to our overhead stereo bus, we need to do a connection like this. If we want to add a panning option, so we can decide if we want to have it more left or right, we need, in this case, not a mono connection, but a mono to stereo connection. New connections will be available. In this case, we would need to send our mono signal through both left and right channels from our overhead bus. And the same thing for the second channel. So this one, in this case, would be wrong. So if we would have a look at the outputs of our buses, and we would have the input of our master out, would look like this. If we want to add a panning option to our snare or to our bass drum, we would need a connection like this, mono to stereo, or we could just keep it mono if we are sure that we don't need to pan those signals. A stereo connection always has a panning option. So the connection we would do would be like this, so that we send the kick drum mono into left and right master output. Same thing with the snare top. And in this case, the left signal to the left output to the left input, and the right output to the right input.